Good morning, everybody. Welcome to World Affairs Fridays. Dr. Peter Siavelis is a professor of politics and international affairs at Wake Forest University, and he is going to give us a great deal to think about this morning. Without further ado, take it away, Dr. Siavelis.
Thank you very much, Angela. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I have a long-standing connection to Peoria. I'm a Bradley grad, so it's always nice to reconnect and touch base with folks in Peoria. So I want to thank you. I want to thank the Peoria Area World Affairs Council for the invitation, and it's a real pleasure and honor to be able to spend some time talking about Chile with everybody here. My presentation is called Political Representation in Chile, as you can see, Crisis, Constitution, and COVID. I like the alliteration a lot, so I strove to do that. But this is a extraordinarily important topic right now because Chile's facing a real turning point in its political history. And in order to kind of make that point, I think I'm just going to go ahead and just jump into my presentation because I want to contextualize what's happening right now with the COVID crisis, and also how the variables I'm going to talk about connect directly. I'm not going to talk a lot about COVID, but everything I'm going to say before I get to my discussion of COVID, it is relevant to how the disease has spread in Chile and why it's much more severe than literally anywhere else in the world. And I'll have some data for that as well. So my presentation, whoops, I'm a bit, all of my Zoom skills, I'm relying on Angela completely, so this might be a little bumpy. But my presentation plan is the following: to give everyone a little bit of background on contemporary Chile, why it's important, what's the context for the crisis the country is currently facing, a consideration of some of the potential reasons for what various scholars have called malestar, which means just bad being, a crisis of representation, a crisis of democracy, or whatever it is. There's a whole debate on what Chile is facing right now among scholars and analysts of Chile. What the response is in terms of the government offering a process for constitutional reform, and then finally a discussion of the impact of COVID in Chile and how it's playing out politically and socially. So just for a little bit of background, Chile really in comparative perspective in the region stands out for its exceptional economic performance. It was often called the Latin American tiger, you know, after the Asian tigers, the spectacular growth rate in the 1990s. A lot of people credit the dictatorship Pinochet-era free market reforms for Chile's success. I think that's way too simplistic because Chile experienced an extraordinary downturn during the Pinochet dictatorship, and a lot of the economic growth that came after was just making up for what was lost. But what's significant is that subsequent democratic governments really did a great job of economic management. Some years better than others, but sometimes approaching a 10% growth rate, which any country would love to experience. It's grown an average of 4.7% a year, and the Chilean economy is now 9 times larger than it was in 1990. That's really an extraordinary economic feat. It's seen as economically vibrant, a good place to invest, Latin America's success story. It was the first country in South America to enter the OECD, and the only other one that's currently a member is Colombia, and that's only been since April of 2020. Oh. Turning to the political arena, Chile also stands out for its model democratic transition. Stability, a smooth transition, a negotiated consensual transition. And I'll talk a little bit about the problem with that towards the end of my presentation. But really, it's one of the freest countries in Latin America politically, with guaranteed basic rights and equality, free and clean elections. The armed forces no longer plays a role in politics. Very scant corruption in comparative terms. If you try to bribe a Chilean police officer, you will get arrested. If you don't bribe an Argentine police officer, you will get in trouble. very strong political parties with strong political bases. That's also eroding, as I want to talk about a little bit. But during the democratic transition, that was the nature of parties, and strong and functional institutions. So in many ways, what we have is a very advanced and solid democracy and a vibrant economy. But this is what we've been seeing in Chile over the last 10 years. This violence, this extreme violence began since the 2010 student strikes for free universal education and free university education. And there's been almost constant since then, with multiple social movements emerging among LGBTQ communities, indigenous communities, women, feminist movements, student movements, worker movements, and environmental movements. It's come to pass that it seems that the only way politics changes in Chile is with the emergence of social movement. But the most significant violence occurred in what Chileans now call the estallido, or the explosion, on October 18th, 2019. I was telling Angela the other day, I left Chile on October 17th, 2019, just missed it. Would have been trapped there for quite some time because the country was shut down and the airports were closed. But as a political scientist, I would have loved to have been able to experience this and see this movement. Now, this is the most significant movement, social movement in Chilean history since the plebiscite of 1988 that ousted Augusto Pinochet from power. This protest that I show a picture of right here, there are 17 million people in Chile. Over 1 million people participated in this protest in central Santiago. Unfortunately, however, the protest turned very violent, with broken windows, smashed statues, businesses destroyed. All of central Santiago was essentially burnt, well, not literally burnt to the ground, although there were few hotels that were set on fire, but was literally brought to the ground. My friends told me all about it. They told me what happened. They sent pictures, but it was really hard to fathom this because downtown Santiago was so modern, so developed, so beautiful, and such a wonderful place to be. I went back in December and then again in March, and I really couldn't believe it. I mean, to me, it looked like a bombed out Port-au-Prince in central Santiago. So the extent of damage is significant, and the complete destruction of the center has not, it continues as these protests continues every day, Friday at 5 o'clock. Now, the sources of the protests are billed in the press almost universally as a response to increases in transport prices. And people might say, well, this is insane. Why such levels of destruction for simply an increase in transport prices? There's two things I wanted to say about that. First, Chile's transport system is private. It's very expensive in relative terms. And if a person takes the subway to and from work, it represents 1/3 of the minimum wage in Chile. So we have these poor households forced to spend 1/3 of their income on transport when we normally talk about spending 1/3 of our income on housing. So that's one factor. But the other factor is that this was only the tip of the iceberg, literally. This is not a response to increase in transport prices. It's a response to the multiple abuses and injustice that Chilean people have had experienced, especially Chilean poor people, over the last 2 decades. You can see the sign there says, no más abusos, no more abuse. And that's essentially what these protests were in response to. And they continue today, even with the COVID crisis. Now, there's also some additional academic evidence regarding Chileans' loss of confidence in their political institutions. Sorry, this is in Spanish. But you don't need to be a Spanish major to figure out what it says. Identification with political parties. Chile was famous historically for its the public's notorious commitment to its political parties. Parties were the center of political life. You could identify someone's partisan stripe by the school they went to. You could identify, somebody would say, oh, you went to Maitencillo? Oh, that's a Christian Democratic beach. or certain soccer clubs were identified with certain political parties. When I was a visiting professor at the Catholic University of Chile, the student government was based on political parties even. So parties were an important fabric of political life. When we have student government elections at Wake Forest, the basic issues usually are party policy, that is to say beer, and parking. Those are the two big issues. When I was a visiting professor at the Catholic University of Chile, the student who ran for president of student government ran on a platform of the elimination of world capitalism. A little bit weightier a subject than just beer or parking, right? So parties really form the fabric of political life. But you can see by this chart that there's been a rapid decline in identification with political parties, where over 90% of the people in the 1990s could identify with a political party. It's down to 45%. I don't have more recent data. It's even lower today, however. Now you might say this is happening everywhere, but really what's remarkable about this is the dramatic pace and how much a drop is and how quickly it occurred. Support for other institutions mirrors something very, very similar. And again, my apologies for this being in Spanish, but this is really confidence in institutions, rated between 1 to 5. And you can see that political parties are at the bottom, 1.7, the Senate, the Chamber of Deputies, the government, all the way to the highest ranking institution, which is your church. And that is only with just bastante confidence, which is just somewhat confident. And in a country that experienced profound human rights abuses and deaths and disappearances at the hands of the armed forces are the second highest rated institution. So Chileans really hold their political institutions in very, very low regard. Ideology was also very important in Chile. It was historically described as one of the most ideologically polarized countries in the world before the dictatorship. Multiple political parties at any one time, 30 parties in the Congress. So very fractured, divided, multi-party system, but also very ideologically wide and with strong ideological commitments. This chart here, what it shows is asking people what political tendency they identify with, and ninguna, which means none, is grown to be the largest, with 57% of the people saying they have no ideological commitment whatever. This was a photo I took at the protests, the student protests before the explosion of 2019. And it says, we are neither left nor right. We are the ones down below, and we're going after the ones on top. This is again reflection of especially younger generations losing their commitment to any sort of ideological framework in the way that my generation of Chileans understands it. So in this sense, we have also a loss of faith in the kinds of ways political change had been undertaken in a country as historically politicized as Chile. So why? Why has this happened? What's behind all this? Almost everybody simply says, oh, I can explain this in one word. It's called inequality. I think inequality is significant, but I think inequality is too simplistic an explanation. And much of my work has been devoted, much of my scholarly work has been devoted to trying to understand the sources of this discontent in Chile. I think there's deeper causes, and some of my research and data I have back my argument up. I think it's really just a growing rejection of the Pinochet political and economic model and institutions associated with them. Chile is still operating under the constitution written by the dictatorship. There's also a series of political institutions, both formal ones and informal ones, that keep both alive. And there's a consistent privileging of stability in Chile over other aspects of democracy that are also important. And if you're interested in more significant proof, as far as we can prove something in political science, I can refer you to some of my work that analyzes this, but I'm just going to summarize my argument as opposed to presenting detailed data regarding how I make this argument. First, it's undeniable that income inequality is part of the story in Chile. I don't doubt that, but what I'm saying is it's only part of the story. It's one of the most unequal countries in the world, less equitable than the income distribution of its neighbors in Peru or Bolivia. In 2006, top 10% of Chileans earned 30 times more in income than the bottom 10%. In 2017, they earned 40 times more. The bottom line is economic growth benefited the rich, but working and middle class people struggle with low wages and job insecurity, with a minimum wage of about $400 a month and prices equivalent to the United States. This is visible in every aspect of the organization of Chilean society. The Santiago is segmented in terms of its population, with the wealthiest population of Santiago living in what's called Barrio Alto, high neighborhood. That means high both in terms of elevation, but also in terms of socioeconomic status. And as you go down lower to lower and lower elevations, the city gets poorer and poorer and poorer. A study was done that showed that Vitacura, the richest comuna, the richest borough in Santiago, had a human development index equivalent to Sweden. And the poorest comuna had a human development index the equivalent of Mali. And we're talking 7 miles apart. In the evening, or in the morning, there's a stream of poor people, mostly browner people, coming up to Barrio Alto to do their jobs in domestic service, and a reverse wave in the evening on the subway back to the neighborhoods, often with 1 or 2 hour commutes in order to reach their jobs. So this inequality is visible in every aspect of society, and you can grow up in Barrio Alto not even knowing that the other Chile exists. I have friends and associates that I know that say, oh, I've never been on the subway. I've never ridden public transport. I've never been in that part of Santiago. And the schools, the churches, the businesses all cater to this wealthier community with no need to venture into other parts of the city. Here is concrete data regarding inequality. Chile is the most unequal country in the OECD. It is often the most unequal country in Latin America, depending on the year. Again, bearing in mind the importance of poverty versus inequality. Chile is the richest country in Latin America in terms of per capita income, but the least equitable. So the fruits of Chile's economic success have been very unequally distributed among the population. This, I think, now is, again, part of the more significant challenge the country faced. In 1981, the Pinochet regime replaced the retirement system with a pay-as-you-go managed pension system. This is part of a whole process of privatization in every sphere and aspect of political and social life, inspired by the experiment of the University of Chicago economist Milton Friedman. For the early years of the Pinochet dictatorship, it was the most capitalistic country in the world, with 0 tariffs, with very little state involvement, the large-scale state employment that characterized the Allende government, which was overthrown, the socialist Allende government, which was overthrown, experienced widespread firing of state employees, liquidation of state institutions, and moving everything into the private sector, making the rich a lot richer and concentrating wealth and the power of political power, economic power, and social power in the hands of a few families who all intermarry among each other and share similar kinds of social life in Barrio Alto. State and business contributed nothing to the pensions. There's high commissions and administrative fees. Many expected this private scheme to deliver 70% replacement rate of their income, and the majority are only getting back 35 to 40%. And some today, a friend of mine whose mother's a retired teacher only receives $315 a month, and that's about 20% of the population that's retired. $315 a month with prices that are the same as the United States. Women who don't work for pay have no pensions, nor do the self-employed. And when I think I think putting ourselves in the position of these people, we can understand some of the anger. But that's not that's not all, as the salesman said. Also in healthcare, under the Allende regime, Chile was headed towards a free universal healthcare system. The Pinochet regime created a for-profit private healthcare system to compete with the government-run system. Private health is prohibitively expensive. 90% of the poorest third of Chileans rely exclusively on the public system. It's critically underfunded and offers lower quality care than the private system. One morning, I was sitting in my apartment in Santiago when I heard a tremendous crash outside my door. I opened the door, and the maintenance man of the building was lying on the floor in front of my door with his toolbox on his head that had fallen from the attic on top of it. I didn't have a phone because the privatized phone system was not working very well, and I was in line, my 6-month line for the phone. So I knocked on my neighbor's door. I said, "Look, Christian fell, something happened to him, we need to call an ambulance." She looked at me and said, "Does he have private or public health care? That determines which ambulance you call," right? She said, "Well, I assume he's poor, so let's call the public ambulance." Two of the sloppiest dressed ambulance attendants with ketchup stains on their white coats march up, pick up Christian by his hands and his feet with no stretcher, and carry him out the door. This is the reality of the kind of inequality that exists in the country. Meanwhile, in the Clínica Alemana, where I go, I have Harvard-trained doctors, American-style hospitals, all the kind of care and the quality of care that you would find in the United States. Education, also privatized. It's one of the most expensive university tuition fees in the world. Costs $3,400 a year on average, when the average annual salary in Chile is $8,500. Upon debt, graduation students have about $40,000 of debt on average, and 40% of Chilean children receive a free secondary education, while the rest go to private or charter schools. So again, poor kids get stuck in mediocre schools, rich kids are clustered at the top. Also, the whole entire educational system was privatized. So you even have to pay, you can send your kids to public schools from kindergarten K through 12, but those schools are so terrible that families don't want to do that. So most of my middle-class friends are saddled with debt from their education, from their K-12 education, and then also university education. This data shows the way this plays out on the ground. So here, the lower, I'm not sure how to use the cursor on this, but you can see at the top left, low-income people, 79% of them go to municipal schools and 20% to vouchers. We go to the highest end, 93% of those go to private schools and only 6.1 to voucher schools, and nobody in the upper sector goes to any sort of public school. This also plays out in terms of testing. So those kids in the private schools, they make up 70% of the students that test into the highest and most coveted professions. Because in Chile, what you study is determined by your test score. This all just reinforces the inequality that I've been talking about. So inequality, yes, undoubtable, but other sources in my work point to this inequality in every aspect of social life. But I also argue that there's a lack of congruence between elites and citizens. This is a more political argument. Disassociation with existing institutions and lack of reform, the inability or unwillingness of governments to reform these private systems, and institutions which reinforce the Pinochet status quo, and even during the democratic period, an obsession with stability over representation. So here, I think this is interesting, and again, I apologize for it being in Spanish. What this is factors that influence poverty for citizens and legislators. These were parallel surveys that were done among members of parliament and the public. So let's remember, the Pinochet dictatorship saw itself as transformative, right? So here people are asked, what are the sources of poverty? both the legislators and the citizens agree that lack of education is important. However, when we go to the second line, citizens identify 16.3% that personal laziness is the second most important factor in poverty, followed by drug addiction and alcohol, right? This is a country that's notoriously unequal, where your family name can determine how much money you have, and the very few people identify these kinds of structural aspects. So having a poor family, 15% of legislators think that's important to continuing poverty, while only 5% of the population. So what this would suggest, one might think, is that Chileans have been transformed by the Pinochet dictatorship. They swallowed the market model. They think individual variables and not the state are the source of poverty. But what's interesting, if you go to this next slide here, looking at elites and masses on the role of the state, again, I'll just summarize for you in English. 48% of Chileans think that all healthcare should be in the hands of the state. 43% think retirement should, much less than the members of Congress. 54% think all schools should be in the hands of the state. 59% think all universities should. Going down the line in every kinds of institution, retirement, banks, 76% should be in the hands of the state. And pharmacies should be state-owned, 80% of the people. So this shows two things, that elites and the masses think very differently about the role of the state, but also this shows that my statement about the children of the dictatorship accepting the market model is probably wrong. And I think this points to something we do as political scientists that is fundamentally erred. We assume that we look at the world through our lens and say, oh, look, these people identify individual variables as the source of poverty, so they must be in favor of the market. And then we look and we say, oh, these people like the state. They must be statists. They must be socialists. No, what it shows for me is the public doesn't think in those terms. The public thinks my retirement stinks. My education stinks. Even if it were in the hands of the state, if they were getting the performance that they're getting from the state, they would hate the system just as much. But they're not getting it out of the private sector. So I don't think we declare Chilean statists or we declare them market champions. We just say that the state and its institutions are not delivering. So in my argument, there's, I think, many, many dimensions of democracy. We always just think about representation. And I would make a similar argument about our system in the United States, that we seek too much stability and we don't have enough representation given our two-party system and our election system. But that's for another PAWAC discussion at some point in the future. There's representation, accountability, legitimacy. Those are all part of democracy. But there's also governability and stability. My argument is all democracies deal with these trade-offs, but Chile fundamentally chose stability and governability over representation. The elites in the country during the democratic transition were unwilling to challenge the status quo and change some of these policies, or to change even the constitution inherited from the dictatorship. And it's not for lack of trying, in some senses. I mean, there was 4 socialist governments since the dictatorship, but socialist in name only. They were not able to advance reforms, nor were they willing to. At the beginning, this made sense because Pinochet repeatedly said if the market model were touched, that he would come back. But after his arrest in London, after his detention, after the loss of his credibility, when there was found significant investments in Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C. under his name, because Chileans would always say, well, you know, he's not a crook like all those other Latin American dictatorships, and he put things in order. Well, we found out that he actually was a crook, right? After losing all this credibility and after kinds of reforms in the military no longer was a threat to Chilean democracy. So as we get to 2000, 2005, 2009, there was plenty of opportunities to try and reform these institutions, do something about it. And that might have stemmed some of the rage we're seeing in the country right now. There was also a series of things that made it quite difficult for Chilean elites to engage in these kind of reforms. The first was a series of the Constitution itself, which made it very difficult to reform it. So written into the Constitution were a series of elements that made it almost impossible to reform. But I point out to my students some of the irony of this. We're talking about an extremely legalistic country. Chile's always been a legalistic country and followed the rules. So in this sense, while Argentina changes its constitution, like you or I change our socks, Chile is unwilling or unable to, given that they follow the rules set out in the Constitution. But the irony is that it's a constitution written by a dictatorship, right? So in that sense, there's a tension there, right? Also, the election system was set up to systematically favor the right. 9 of the 38 senators were appointed by members of the armed forces, which prevented a majority in the Senate. So in many, many ways, the system was set up to enhance stability, to enhance governability, but really not allow for any kinds of significant reforms. So this is the best way to understand what happened in 2019, in October. People talked about increased public transport as the reason for the kinds of unrest and instability we're seeing in the country. But under that tip of the iceberg was the worst education system in South America, one of the most expensive, poor condition of the healthcare system, pension system crisis, miserable salaries, precarious jobs in a 45-hour work week, police that embezzled from the government. This is the first sort of big instance of corruption. And salaries of the political elite were 33 times higher than the minimum wage. Chilean deputies and senators were the second highest paid in the Americas after the United States. Lots of collusion among these families that own these economic conglomerates. There was scandals about price collusion for all things toilet paper, chicken, shipping companies, and pharmacies. Basic staples of Chilean life. And people joked that they couldn't even go to the bathroom without the political elite trying to skim something from the top, the political and economic elites. And it's the only country in the world that privatized its water. So water is a private commodity in Chile and can be sold by people who own it. So this, again, I think does a good job, along with my political analysis of the lack of responsiveness of the political elite to these problems, and a political system that was set up to be very, very conservative and prevent reform to a lot of these systems. So what are the demands of the protesters? Well, the estallido, the explosion, really scared the political elite and scared the conservative government of Sebastián Piñera. And they finally gave in to the demand for a new constitution. That was at the core of what the protesters were demanding. They want to trash the Pinochet constitution and write a new one. There was a referendum set for April, but we all know what happened. It's now been postponed until October. And the question will be a twofold question. Should there be a new constitution? Yes or no? And if yes, if you answer yes, the second question is, should it be a constitutional convention, or that's directly elected, or a mixed constitutional convention made up of half the currently sitting members of parliament and half of elected citizens? Right now, polling shows 70% support for a new constitution, 50% support for the convention, and 30% for the mix, with 20% not knowing or not making up their mind yet. As this constitutional process moves forward, obviously the big unknown variable is the COVID response, and what's going to happen with COVID, and what's going to happen in April if the pandemic. Most people don't know this, but Chile has the highest rate of COVID cases per capita in the world. I mean, with a population that's about as half of Spain's, you can see it has, you know, what, three times as many cases, right? And per capita, the highest in the world. And so this is puzzling to a lot of people, and they wonder why, especially given that Chile's private healthcare system is lauded as being so advanced and the most advanced in Latin America. Well, the problem was good initial response, passes for travel, and a lockdown. And again, because of Chile's level of development and the wealth of its political elite, it was the first country in Latin America to be struck with the COVID pandemic, given how many people travel regularly outside, mostly to the United States and Europe, and then come back to Chile. So the first outbreak of the disease was among the wealthy in Barrio Alto. But also we add to that domestic service. So people continued to work in domestic service, and so there was this interchange between the rich and the poor. There's concentration of population in the capital. 40% of the population live in metropolitan Santiago. So we have a very crowded city, much like the outbreak that we had in New York, but this is 40% of the country. Multi-generational families. Chileans tend to live with their parents and grandparents and children in multi-generational households, much more than in the United States or in Europe. The inequality I talked about. So, as I said, my whole presentation has something to do with the COVID outbreak and how it was handled. Because of this tremendous inequality, it spread like wildfire through the poor shanty towns of Santiago, where some people often did not have access to running water to even wash their hands. The incredible inequality also reflected in the divided public health sector. The public hospitals were not set up to be able to deal with this outbreak, while the private hospitals were better positioned to do so. And a really inefficient and crowded public transport system that just exacerbated the entire outbreak. So Chile's right now at a turning point. We all have pandemic and economic challenges, and we recently have social unrest in our country as well, but nowhere near the level that Chile is experiencing right now. There's complete uncertainty regarding the plebiscite and the constitutional reform effort, even more damaging protests than ours on top of it happening every day. I love Chile. It's a country I've lived in for many years and studied for 30 years and was very positive about it. So I really hate to be bleak. But one little anecdote I share, and I hope this is not true, is I was giving a presentation at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C. in the 1990s. And I told the happy story of Chile, the story of the democratic transition, of economic growth, of being the South American tiger. I did recognize some of the problems, but essentially painted a pretty positive view of where the country was and where it was going. And a gentleman in the back, an elderly gentleman, stood up and he raised his hand and he said, I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought it was excellent. And I hate to tell you this, but he said, way back in 1976, I gave the very same talk about Venezuela that you just gave. Well, we know where Venezuela is now. Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America in the 1970s and had an unresponsive political elite. And we saw what happened. I hope with good, responsible leadership, something like that can be avoided. And I hate to end on a negative note, but I do think this constitutional reform process is key to the way things are going to play out. I have concerns about the complete constituent assembly. You might call me anti-democratic, but we also saw what the Constitutional Constituent Assembly wrote in Venezuela. And Chile has a long tradition of constitutional history that could be drawn upon to make a constitution that's more responsive to the political demands, but at the same time is more of a blueprint for balancing stability with these citizen demands. Thank you for your attention. And thank you all for being here. I really enjoyed being with you virtually, and I'm happy to answer any questions or to have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Can I ask you to stop sharing, and then we'll get a bigger picture of you, and I can ask you some questions from the chat. And while we're thinking about it, I do have I'd like to start off with a question about the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Only Chile and Colombia for Latin and South America belong. What are the requirements for getting into that organization?
It's essentially a certain level of economic development and a certain human development index. I mean, there's a series of factors that measure economic growth, that measure economic stability, that measure how much reserves a country has, how indebted the country is. So it's a combination of factors that determine it. It's not just the only country in South America was Chile. Mexico is also in the OECD. So
okay.
Latin America, yes, South America.
Okay, thanks. And then from the chat, we've got a couple of questions about Chile's relationship to the United States. What's been Chile's, let's see, what has been the relationship between Chile and the Trump administration, and how will the upheaval in Chile impact Latin American policy? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the Trump administration's relationship with all of Latin America is fraught with difficulties, right? Obama was extraordinarily popular in Latin America. And the United States is not usually very popular in Latin America, given our past, given the intervention that's taken place, and even the intervention that took place in support of the 1973 coup in Chile. So it's a difficult relationship, but had been improving over the course of history, and especially under the Obama administration. Right now, it's in all of Latin America, the response of the Trump administration to issues of immigration and the way that Trump talks about Latinos has made him extraordinarily unpopular. Mm. Also, in many senses, the Trump administration has had an isolationist policy, has not really dealt with Latin America much, and its anti-trade rhetoric really does not play well in Chile in terms of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and a series of other trade agreements that Chile belongs to, with the U.S. efforts to withdraw. So you could almost say that the administration has abdicated any role in terms of promoting better relationships with Latin America and with Chile, except when Venezuela, except for the hostility towards Venezuela and its government.
Okay, very good. Do you have a sense of the earnings disparity between, comparing Chile's earning disparity with the United States?
Yeah, the United States, among advanced industrialized countries, is the most unequal, right? I don't know offhand the Gini coefficient, but Chile's Gini coefficient is 50, 54, 56, depending on the year. If I'm not mistaken, I think the United States is in the mid-20s or 30s, but I'd have to check on that. So the United States is the most unequal country among the advanced industrialized countries, but it doesn't approach the level of inequality that exists in countries like Chile, Colombia, or Brazil.
Okay, interesting. Another one from the chat. Diane says, por favor, no es necesario disculparse por español. But for some of us, it is necesario.
Bueno, muchas gracias, le agradezco. Y podemos seguir conversando en español si quiere.
But for the rest of us, inglés, por favor. All right. And then the military, can you comment about the military being called upon to quell domestic unrest in October? Does this give pause to the contention that the military remains and has remained non-political?
Yes, that's a really, really good question. Because my assertion about the military being apolitical was based on essentially the 1990s, right? And the early 2000s. Really, almost up until the 2010, when the student protests started. just a funny anecdote. I mean, I had lived in Chile during the end of the Pinochet dictatorship and the first democratic government. In my view, I had been tear gassed, I'd been water cannoned, I'd been involved in some of the protests and things like that. So my view of the military was very negative, and I had that. Not to mention the human rights abuses and the detention camps and everything. But I was walking in the late 1990s or mid 2000, yeah, with a friend. And she had never been to Chile before. She was our director of international programs. And I said, you know, let's cross the street to avoid these police that were guarding a government building. And she insisted on walking up closer. And I'm like, you're going to get us in trouble, right? And all of a sudden, the guard went, psst, come here, right? So we walk up to him, and I'm like, oh, great, yeah. Right? He says to her, hello, are you from America? We want to practice our English. And I was like, I mean, but what had been going on under the surface was an effort within the armed forces to really transform the image of the armed forces in the eyes of the public. You know, this is all after Pinochet gets arrested and all this sort of stuff, in efforts to come to, you know, human rights roundtables to assess the past, to account for the past, to document the past. So it was moving in the right direction. Then this happens, right? And there's been, again, like disturbing parallels, right? The president said when the protests broke out, the president said, these are terrorists backed by foreign forces, saying Venezuela and Cuba. These are terrorists backed by foreign forces. And that's exactly the rhetoric used before the military coup. Also, the methods used by the police to quell rioters are really, I mean, very violent. And many of you might have seen the piece in the New York Times about the number of protesters that have been blinded by rubber bullets. It's very violent. There's also allegations of that the Inter-American Human Rights Commission has been investigating allegations of torture, and there's some evidence that some torture did take place. So calling the police and the military out against your own people, which is also happening somewhere else, is a disturbing trend in the development of civil-military relations. And also, this idea of a state at war with its people is very disturbing for someone who studies Latin America, because that's how that's been the past of these dictatorships.
Yeah, interesting. And I found it, that makes it even more ironic that the people seem to be, trust the military. On the one chart you had, the military ranks right up there with, you know, the top things in the society, in spite of the reality of the military.
I think that if that survey was from before the 2019.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
So I think that right now, I think the police and the armed forces would be right down in the toilet with everybody else.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Aria, go ahead and unmute yourself. And while you do, I want to give Kate's update. She says, Google says that the USA's Gini coefficient is 0.434, according to Pew Social Trends.
Okay, so it's, yeah, with Chile's higher, so that's higher than I thought. I thought it was 3, but yeah, so that tells you. And that's probably, you know, reflecting, because it's been getting worse. Since the Roosevelt administration, it's gotten worse and worse and worse and worse.
Yeah. Aria, are you ready to ask your question?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. What does, in one of the images that you show, when it says no more abuso, no más abusos, the S's, or la S has like these things. What does that mean? What they did it? Is that like a sign of dollars, or is a reference to something?
Let me see. Let's take a look at it. I didn't notice that. Yes, yeah, you're right. Yeah, yeah, dollar signs, right?
I didn't know. First I thought dollar signs, but then I thought probably it's related to an internal joke about, I don't know. I was just, I don't know.
I think it's dollar signs.
Okay.
Angela, I can't see anybody anymore because I went to my presentation. What do I do?
Oh, upper right-hand corner, you should see like a gallery view or something like that. If you click on your face, there'll be, you know, the little boxes will show up. Oh, you went to your presentation. On the bottom of your screen, you should be able to find your bar that has.
Okay, I can see now. Okay,
There you go.
thank you.
And then my second question is more in related, you touch upon a little bit, but I would like, I am a big admirer of, oh, I'm forgetting Michelle Bachelet. I love her campaign, political campaign. I love some of the programs that she had in Chile. So did nothing that she did help the country at some point, or because they have returned back to a more right-wing approach, the things have become even more in disparity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Bachelet as well, and I had the opportunity to interview her, which was really exciting. And I think she's very underappreciated. Like, she did engage in some of this. She attempted some of the reforms that I've talked about, and she did achieve a reform of the Pinochet era electoral system. But I think, and also some reforms to the healthcare system to require a certain number of conditions that even if people in the public system got those conditions, that they would have to be treated in a private hospital that had the expertise to deal with certain kinds of cancer. The role of women, allowing domestic unions among same-sex couples. So she did a lot, and I think it's really unappreciated because of, I'll put it just bluntly, misogyny. That I just don't think that being a woman that she got the credit for doing. Actually, I think being one of the most successful post-authoritarian presidents. Also, she was tainted a little bit by corruption, which was not her doing, it was her son's. Her son did some insider trading, and she got punished for it. And all the research shows that in Latin America, women politicians are more trusted than men politicians, but when they engage in corrupt activities, they're judged more harshly.
Those darn children, I tell you, they can get you into such trouble.
Yeah, I said to my friends, I said, the one thing I blame Bachelet, she handled it badly. Like, she was at the beach when this all came out. She didn't come back from the beach to Santiago. I would have come back right to Santiago and said, my son will be like subject to the full extent of the law, and nothing, he won't get special treatment. And just, she should have said that, and she didn't. Yeah. Also, if I were elected president of any country, the first thing I would do is sit my children down and say, don't do anything, at least for 4 years.
Country. Yeah, any country at all, you're right.
Maybe I'm being misogynistic by saying, but I think as a man or a woman, you should do that, right?
Yeah. But as we know, some parents don't say anything to their kids, and they do whatever.
Yeah. Like, he's like, my kid. When I looked at his picture when this was all happening, and I was like, oh my God, the guy looks like a creep. I mean, you can just tell by looking at him.
That's funny. Another comment, I'm going to turn it into a question from our chat, is about Santiago. And did you say that 40% of the population of Chile lives in Santiago? Is that correct? Yes. So the high parts of the town and the low parts of the town are not necessarily unique to Latin America. People who live up on the hill in other countries don't get hit by hurricanes in the United States, for example, like the people who live in the lower lying areas. But one of the things you had mentioned about Santiago was that the high areas where the rich people live were hit first by the COVID-19 because they travel. Did the upper class take any real blame for that, or was it just, now it's all the domestics and everybody else who's passing it in those tightly packed cities that have, as Mike points out, the shacks and that are permanent residences. They're not temporary residences. Are they the ones taking the blame for the spread of COVID-19, or does the upper class get any credit since they brought it in the first place?
I don't think that, I mean, almost everything is cast in class terms in Chilean society because it's one of the most classist societies in the world. I'm going to close my door for a second.
I just want, in the meantime, he's gone. I just want to share, in Brazil, it has been proven that one of the outcomes, I think it was in Sao Paulo, was caused by a person that had traveled from Italy back to Brazil, and all of a sudden he went to the hospital, of course, but also all the crew members, like maids,
Right.
drivers, and everybody start getting sick and started spreading. And of course, well, it was just an accident. Never, nobody had been, you know.
Yeah, well, it all depends on who's shaping the narrative, right? So if the upper
Right.
class controls the message, then it's not the upper class's fault. It's the peons, it's the workers, it's the people living too close together. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I was going to say there's a class dimension to absolutely everything in Chile, but I think in this particular case, given the magnitude of the crisis, I don't think the poor are sort of blaming anybody. They're blaming more the rich for this complete package of injustices that I've talked about that's reflected in the way that virus has impacted people differently, just as in the United States, it's impacted different social classes differently.
And if you have a question, please, type it in the chat or do the raise your hand thing and I'll call on you. Here's another one before I ask my question. How do Chileans perceive criminal justice? One of the major trends right now is about the trial of an accused rapist.
Yeah, before this all broke out, there was high levels of trust in the criminal justice system 10 years out from the dictatorship, right? When the judges that were appointed by the dictatorship started to cycle through and get through the judicial system. So there was pretty high level of confidence in it, and a strong element of pro law and order and especially on the right in Chile, right? That's all deteriorated right now. Now there's this perception that there's serial abuses, that the same kinds of undocumented arrests that we're seeing in other places in the world are also happening in Chile right now. So I think the criminal justice system in the eyes of the Chilean public is really, again, just a broader part of this lack of confidence in almost any institution of society. I'm a little bit hopeful in some of the data because there's a higher level of trust among Chileans for local government. So when asked about people's city council or their mayors, they tend to be a little bit more supportive. So I'm hoping somehow with this new constitution that we could build on that from the bottom up to try and increase some confidence in political institutions in the country, which I think will help. And that could spread over into the criminal justice system as well. There's a lot of investigations going on right now regarding police abuse and police activity in the National Human Rights Commission, even in Chile.
Very interesting. You have given us a great deal to think about. We have reached 12 o'clock. Unless anybody has a last pressing issue, I wanted to ask about mining and some of the international business activities that go on in Chile. To what extent is the government of Chile a slave, if you will, to global business interests, especially mining, for example, or shipping?
In 1973, when the copper mines were nationalized by the Chilean government, prompting the intervention of the Nixon administration, because they were American copper companies, right? That was nationalized with compensation, right? But the companies undervalued, for tax reasons, the value of their business, of course, right? So the Chilean government paid them what they said they were worth,
Right.
but that's not what they were worth, right? At that point, copper made up 70% of income of the country. 70%, right? Right now, with the diversification in wine, which my cellar is full of Chilean wines, and if yours is not, it ought to be.
It's delicious.
Yeah. Fruits, all of the winter fruit we have in the United States, because the seasons are reversed, comes from Chile, because Chile is like California. It has the same kind of climate, the Central Valley. That's why it produces wines and fruits. Salmon, forestry. So through all this diversification, wood chips of all things, right? Through all this diversification, copper's down to 40%.
Oh, okay.
But that's still significant.
Mm-hmm.
So what the Chilean policymakers care much more about what's happening in Beijing than they do about what's happening in the United States, because China is Chile's the major buyer of Chilean copper. And so if the Chinese economy gets sick, gets a cold, right, the Chilean economy gets pneumonia, right?
Mm-hmm.
So also with all of the instability, the peso has like really plummeted. In a sense, that's good for Chilean exporters, right? But at the same time, it's not good for the people in terms of their ability to afford any imported products. But Chile still is primarily, to get to your question, still dependent on copper, and still dependent on the world the international system and the world economy. And that's why they're such advocates of free trade.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Siavelis. This has been a very stimulating discussion of Chile, and an important neighbor to our south, if not a partner, as close of a partner as the United States probably should be looking at them. This has been a Fridays World Affairs, or World Affairs Fridays rather, by the Peoria Area World Affairs Council. And next week, remember, we have 3 things on our horizon for next week. On Sunday, we have a conversation with Ray LaHood. Secretary LaHood wrote a book when he stepped away from Congress in 2015 called Seeking Bipartisanship. And there's never been a time in my lifetime that we've needed it more. So if you would like to join us for our book club discussion, be sure that you register for that event on Sunday at 2 p.m. And then on Tuesday night, we are partnering with the Tennessee World Affairs Council for a discussion with Rear Admiral Green, I believe, about U.S. relations with China, but particular focus on the military relations like the South China Sea. And then on Friday next week, we will have a discussion, certain to be a lively discussion, of the relationship between the Palestinians and Israelis with Peter Beinart. So we've got some exciting things coming up in August. We're going to talk about Cuba and then just taking off from there. So become a member and send your questions or comments to us. Follow us on Facebook. And once again, thank you very much, Peter, and everybody have a great weekend. If you're bored, come up to Princeville to the Heritage Museum and Tractor Show. So.
Thank you, Angela. I really want to thank you. This was really engaging and stimulating, and the questions were fantastic. So
good.
You were right. This is a great group. So thank you for, it's been a pleasure to be able to talk with you all.